Welcome back to another reading and correcting of Bottom Rung with me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger's supervisor. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. And this morning we are doing Chapter 13. The man, Alistair, wore iridescent leather armor with a knife at his belt. His eyes were so blue Tibs had trouble looking away, wondering if they would start glowing. His face was long, thin, but healthy. His gray hair was held in with a ribbon that matched his eyes, but not intensity. You summoned me in the middle of work. His voice was deep, surprised Tibbs by how calm and soothing it was. I couldn't simply leave and reveal I was present. Discretion takes time, but I am here. I am here now, as you requested. This is Tibbs, Tyrannia indicated him, our newest potential water rogue. Okay, rogues is not capitalized. Alistair looked at Tibbs as if he just now realized he was there. Is this a joke? He asked, frowning. Do you recall the last time I joked? His face grew somber, jaw tightening. He looked Tibbs over again, taking his time. He's only a child, he finally said. It's too early for him to get an element. It's going to kill him. He's old enough to have been in a cell when the recruitment started. The man waved that aside. You know very well some kingdoms will put babes in prison with their mother just because she had the misfortune of catching the wrong noble's fancy. He survived the dungeon long enough to sit before me, she replied, fixing the man with her color-shifted eyes. Where are you from, Tibbs? He asked, like the answer would settle the point. The street? The streets? Tibbs answered. I mean which kingdom? Alistair's tone took on a hint of annoyance. Alistair, Turner said with an amused shake of the head. Maybe you didn't have the misfortune of growing up on the street. But for those of us who did, the world doesn't extend past the blocks we could know well enough to hide from the city guards and other dwellers of the street. You won't know the name of the city you lived in, let alone the kingdom. When Alistair was looking at him again, Tim shrugged. Then do you know where he's from? He asked Tyrannia. You know how it goes when a new dungeon opens, she replies with a sigh. Every kingdom sends us as many people as they can manage, in the hopes we'll view them favorably once it's time to assign slot to their nobility after the kingdom graduates. Someone at the main guild probably has the records of where everyone's from, but I doubt they'll bother with names. Alistair didn't reply, and silence fell on the room. Silence fell over the room. Tibbs fidgeted and wondered if he could leave while they resolved whatever this was about. Alistair turned and headed for the door. No, I won't be part of what is effectively murder. Alistair, she said, and as his hand reached for the handle, her voice was hard and cold. Do you need to be reminded of your duties again? The man turned slowly, and Tibbs caught him rubbing his left wrist over the sleeve. He stopped it, looking at Tibbs, who hurried to face Tyrannia again. I know my duties, Tyrannia, he replied, but I am a thief, not an assassin. Get Gerard for this. He isn't going to care what happens to Tibbs. Gerard is working for the Central Guild at the moment, not me. And Tibbs doesn't need an assassin at this stage. He's still simply a thief, and that's your department. She raised a hand to silence him. Before you protest, he passed the first test. He is Upsilon. So he has what is required to gain an audience, despite what you believe. Alistair returned to stand beside Tibbs. He placed a hand on the back of the chair and looked down at him. Tell her no. Say you aren't ready. I don't care what that crystal of hers says. You don't have to do this. Not right now. Wait a few years. Tibbs studied the man's face, looking for deception, but he was earnest. Whatever this was about, he believed Tibbs would be in danger if he did this, so he considered the situation and quickly realized he didn't have enough information. What happens if I wait? He asked Tyrannia, and Alistair sighed in relief. She nodded and smiled in satisfaction. You go back to the dungeon, just as you will once you have your element. Tyrannia, Alistair began in exasperation, but a raised hand from her silenced him again. She didn't look away from Tib. So nothing changes, Tib said tentatively, knowing he was wrong before her expression shifted and he turned everything she'd said since he'd arrived over in his head. Things would be different, but what and how did it matter? What mattered to him? Mama, the man who'd hurt her, which meant he needed to leave here eventually. Can I reach Epsilon without an element? She smiled in satisfaction again before looking at Alistair. Well? No, the man answered reluctantly. The element is the main component of how we test you for graduating to other ranks. But you don't need to do this now, he hurried to add. Just wait a year. The odds of surviving the audience will be much higher. That was good information to have. As with most things in his life, older people had better odds of surviving. But the dungeon is going to get harder, right? What had the archer said? The dungeon didn't make changes to make things easier on them. The dungeon needed to feed, and they needed to die for that. So as they got better, it got harder. He looked from one to the other for confirmation and got it from Alistair in the way he tensed, in the way he looked to Tirania for support. So the only way I can survive, Tibs continued more to himself since she wanted him to work this out, is by getting stronger too. You don't need an element to be stronger, Alistair said. Tibs glared at him. I know you're lying. Everyone around me dies in the dungeon because we're not strong enough. I have to be stronger to make sure that stops happening. I believe you have your answer, Alistair. Tyrania's expression was the smugness of a con woman who'd gotten a mark to hand over their wealth without having to tell them to. Tibbs thought he should feel bad about playing a part in that, but he and her wanted the same thing, if not for the same reasons. Alistair looked at Tibbs, his eyes sad. They hardened as he shifted his gaze to her. Fine, I will do this, since I'm not given a choice, but I will be back to Rania. This conversation isn't over. I cannot wait to hear what you have to say, Alistair, she replied, smiling. Oh, and while you're at it, Tibbs is interested in finding out about the level we use to grade guild members. Fill him in on the way to the audience. The glaring continued for a few seconds, and Alistair turned. Come, Tibbs, we have a ways to walk. Tibbs exited with Alistair, and the few people in the building gave them a wide berth. Tibbs counted his step as they walked through the building and decided he made a mistake somewhere because he ended up with something larger than what he knew the outside to be. Outside the building they reached for outside the building they headed for the center of the town, and people moved out of their way, sometimes without even looking at them. Was Alistair doing something? Was it some power of his element? Or were they simply feeling the man's anger at being cornered into doing this? Their destination came into view when Alistair finally spoke, his voice calm. You really don't know about levels? Someone mentioned Delta, and Tyrannia said that once I became Epsilon, I'd be free. Is that what she said? He asked, looking at him suspiciously, then away, and his tone became annoyed. Of course she did. She told me the same thing. He stopped rubbing his left wrist, and Tibbs looked ahead as he felt the man's gaze. There are 10 levels, from the weakest to the strongest. They are Omega, Upsilon, Rho, Lambda, Zeta, Epsilon, Delta, Gamma, Beta, and finally Alpha. Tibbs had a long ways to go before reaching Epsilon. Is Tirania Alpha? Alistair snorted. No, she's Beta. Only Gamma and above can be in charge of a guild. So our leader is Alpha. Alistair shook his head. There hasn't been an Alpha level adventurers for more than a thousand years. So you need There hasn't been an Alpha level adventurer for more than 1,000 years. Do you need me to repeat the levels? Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, Epsilon, Zeta, Lambda, Rho, Upsilon, and Omega. I have it. Alistair smiled at him. Good. They reached a transportation platform, and Alistair bypassed the line of merchants and other travelers to step on it. The only kind of people Tibbs didn't see in the lines were runners. Those he did see stood at the periphery, more than one, with a calculating look on their face. Tibbs had stood where they did a few times, trying to come up with a way to escape, but as far as he could figure out, the men and women wearing the golden robe, like the one who joined them as Alistair stepped in front of the person waiting, were required to make it work, even when they weren't the ones making the gestures before they vanished. This time Alistair was the one who gestured, and they weren't in the town anymore. Tibbs readied himself for the wave of nausea he felt the first time he'd been through this kind of transport, when he'd first been sent to the dungeon town, but he felt fine. The first thing he noticed was the humidity. It was thick and pressing in on him. The cave was illuminated with crystals around the platform and lining a large hallway in the distance. Lining a large hallway. In the distance, Tibbs heard falling water, the kind that reminded him of the worst storms he'd been in when the house he'd taken refuge had shaken with the thunder and the rain fell so hard it pushed through the cracks. Come, Alistair instructed as he stepped off the platform. They got over his surprise and caught up with him as he entered the hallway. If you are going to have any chance of surviving this, the man said, remember to treat water with respect. He's a force of nature, not a mark for you to steal from. You have to impress him with your willingness to work for him. Tib stopped. Am I going to be a slave? He'd spent his life staying out of the grass of people like that on the street. Of course not, Alistair answered, not stopping. It's a symbiosis. Do you understand what the word means? Tibbs ran up to him. I don't. A partnership, then. You know that one? Tibbs nodded. If you survive, water will give you some of himself to control, to obey your will, but in return, part of your will is going to bend to him. Your interaction with him will change how you think in a way that serves him. It isn't anything big. Even knowing this, you won't notice it until you look back at your life and see all the little ways in which your behavior echoed that of water. Just wonder if he'd made the right choice. Now that he knew this, Tyrannia said water was about protection, and he wanted that. But did it mean he wouldn't want his revenge after this? Maybe fire would have been a better choice. Fire burned everything, so it had to be okay with revenge. The sound of falling water grew louder as the humidity grew thicker. They passed doors made of what looked like crystal until they reached an open doorway, which the man entered. More open doorways lined the hall. The halls, and in the distance, this made out the rolling fog where the sound came from, but it didn't spread into the hall. Tibbs, the man called as he entered the room. The man called, and he entered the room. Water flowed up to fill the doorway, then turned to clear ice. He felt the cold emanating from it. Did you do that? Alistair shook his head and motioned to the center of the room. This is water's domain. He governs what happens here. We are all at his mercy. Tibbs stood where indicated. You must kneel. Tibbs did as instructed, and Alistair crouched next to him, a hand on his shoulder. Are you certain you want to do this, Tibbs? The danger is real. Isn't it too late to turn back? I don't think so. The man hesitated. I'm on good terms with Water. I've acted to his benefit for years. If I speak to him on your behalf, I'm sure he would give you a reprieve and let us go. He could change his mind, pick fire, and be sure of his revenge. What will Tyrannia say? Alistair chuckled. Don't worry about her. I can handle her tantrum. But Tib saw how the man's hand twitched toward the left one on his shoulder. Alistair noticed him watching. It's nothing more than a nervous tick. The memory of when I was younger, not as smart about whose instruction I follow and how. So the mark isn't forever. You serve your time, then it's removed. Hopefully you've learned your lesson by then. Tib was strangely comforted by the idea Bardic would regain his freedom, eventually. Did you? Alistair chuckled. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't. The guild's patience isn't limitless. Now, shall we leave? Tib shook his head. He realized that Alistair was the reason. He liked the man. He could see the sternness in his eyes, but he also was kind and caring. He was willing to risk angering his leader to keep Tibs safe a little longer. Just wonder where he would be now if he'd met someone like Alistair before. The thought was more melancholy than anything else. The past couldn't be changed. All he could do was move forward, and he decided that he would do his best to do so with Alistair at his side. So be it, Alistair said, resigned. Remember, Tibbs, there are things far greater than us in the world, and you are about to meet one of them. Know your place. Your life depends on it. Alistair stood, removing his hand. Water filled his mouth. Tibbs had no idea where it came from. Hadn't it been air around him moments before? Wasn't it still? He tried to cough the water out, but it only served to let more in. He turned to Alistair, reached for the man, but his expression was impartial. He didn't move. Had it all been a trick? He seemed so kind. No, he refused to believe the man had tricked him. He'd warned him there would be danger, and he just had to think this through. He closed his mouth to keep more water from entering, but he still needed to breathe, wanted to breathe. He pinched his nose to block the reflex. Was this part of the audience? It had to be. The thought didn't calm Tibbs. What kind of element was water that it treated him this way? Was a partnership built on putting one side of this kind of pain in danger? He needed air. He should have picked air. At least he wouldn't be drowning. Stars appeared in his vision. He was dying, he realized. He put this trust in someone, something, and he had been wrong. Trust. Partnership were built on that, weren't they? Was that it? How could he show his trust here? He closed his eyes as he moved his hand to his side. He was already falling forward. It would happen regardless. He might as well make it his decision, his show us trust. He took a deep breath of water and found himself spinning head over heel. Hello, thing of humans, the voice said, coming from all around him. Oh my, you are a small one. Tibbs opened his eyes to find the speaker. The voice was that of a woman, gentle and comforting. Reflexively, he tried to stop his tumble, to grab onto anything, but there was nothing. No floor, no wall, no Alistair. Just water. Where was the room? The light seemed to come from the water itself, and an even blue-green glow. And who are you, small one? The voice, the woman, asked, and Tibbs thought he could make out forms moving around him. He opened his mouth to answer and immediately covered it with his hand before it filled with water. Giggles filled the surrounding water, gentle instead of mocking. Oh, it's too late for that. I am all there is here. Tibbs took a tentative breath. He felt the water move in and out of the motion, but he didn't choke on it. You all do this, she said. Even knowing what I am, you expect me to be something else. Who are you? He asked. His voice sounded different, deeper. I am water, of course. And who are you? I'm Tibbs. He slowed his stumble with a waving of the hand and felt better. With the lack of anything to see, he could convince himself he was still. A form stilled before him. She reminded Tibbs of a woman wrapped in a shifting blue-green fabric. He was surprised. From listening to Alistair, he'd expected a man. The form, the woman, studied him. At least he thought so. He couldn't make out details, but she seemed to be looking at him. Tell me, Tibbs of the humans, why are you here? Tibbs opened his mouth to explain about protecting people, but the world shifted around him. Mama! He crouched on the floor in a dingy room. The woman lying on the pallet before him coughed, and flecks of blood appeared on her lips. She forced a smile. It's all right, she said, her voice raw. Mama will be all right. She wouldn't be. Even as young as he was, he knew that. She hadn't been all right for a time now. When had she stood last? When had she walked out of this box they lived in to get him some moldy bread or a wrinkled apple? Mama wasn't all right, and Tibbs was scared. I am sorry. The voice soothed him. He uncurled and hoped the water hid his tears. How he missed Mama. It is the way of your kind to come to an end, she said, the soothing tone doing nothing to soothe Tibbs's pain. What would you want of me? Tibbs calmed himself, readied himself again to talk of protection, but his voice caught as his mouth turned into a snarl. What good would protection do, Mama? Making sure others didn't die was all fine and good, but what about her? What about Mama? Something flicked within the form. He forced his anger down. Water was about protection. She wouldn't approve of his anger, would she? Alistair wanted him to know his place, and here what he had been about, and here he had to be about protecting others. He gritted his teeth at the thing as the thing flicked again. Maybe he could lie to her, to Water, but lie to himself? Did he even want a partnership with Water? He'd considered fire when given an option, but that was the past. That was the past now. Tibs? She called, and he wrenched his eyes away from the flicker. What had that even been? He felt calmer now. What do you want? His eye glanced back at the flicker before he could stop himself. Was it a show of disrespect that he looked at that instead of her? What was it? There was no blue or green about it, so what color could it be? Was it even a color? No, Tibbs, you don't want this. She sounded sad. She sounded sad. She knew it was there. What is it? She hesitated. It is something complicated. I don't understand. It's all right, she smiled. She smiled at him. It's all right. She was right. With her, it would be all right. If not now, in time. What do you want of me? Again, his eyes moved to the flicker. He ran out of the box he and Mama called home, yelling for help, being ignored. He saw the uniforms, city guards. Mama said to stay away, but Tibbs had seen some of them help in the market. A well-dressed older woman. Mama had taken him before she was sick. He went to them, begged for them to help Mama. Laughing, they followed him. He tried to tell them this was no game, but they kept laughing. One entered the box, called the others, until there was only one left with him, who kept him out of the box. Mama screamed. Men laughed inside. The one with him held him, prevented him from going to Mama's rescue. It lasted a long time. Then she fell silent. Afterward, so did the men. They laughed, and Tibbs ran in. Mama was still, exposed. He covered her, needing to believe she was sleeping. He curled up against her, forcing himself to ignore the wrongness of how still she was. He stayed with her as realization grew in time with the cold of her body. He felt something he'd never felt before, a new and powerful emotion. Tibbs hated. He hated the man who had hurt Mama, the sickness that had made her weak, himself for not protecting her, for bringing the man to her, for the street that had been their only world, where he had to learn to steal, to survive, hide, to stay ahead of those who wanted the little he had. He wanted them all to pay, to destroy them. To destroy them, the thought dissolved under a cool touch. It is also in my nature. It is also in the nature of your kind to be in and cause pain. But it isn't in my nature to run hot. I am sorry, Tibbs. This is not something I can offer. His eyes went to the flicker. Something a myriad of color. Sometimes a myriad of colors, sometimes not. Maybe, she said, and Tibbs looked at her. It is possible that it can give you what you want, but it will not be an easy path. Her touch cooled him, soothed the pain. I can take it away. With me, you can move on, do something better for others. But can, but that can make them pay. He hated himself for the harshness in his voice. She didn't deserve that. She wanted to help him. He should accept her help, let her take his pain away. But what of Mama then? If you are strong enough, know that if you choose it over me, there will be no certainty. It is a complicated path that will barely reward you until you have done enough. You will not be able to depend on it, and in the end, it may demand more than you can give. But with it, there's a chance I can avenge Mama. Her nod felt sad. It can certainly run hot enough for that. Tibbs forced himself to calm down, something he thought her presence helped with. What would he sacrifice? Was willing to sacrifice? If I choose that over you, you say I'll get little, but what will I get? You will get a little of me. I am connected to it, after all. If not, you wouldn't see it. but it will be so little that it is best you choose me. I can promise you a long and fulfilling life. A long life would give him time. Time to come up with another way to achieve his revenge, maybe. If she didn't change him so much, he wouldn't want it any more. Could he abandon Mama like that? He made his choice and reached through her to the flicker. It jumped to his hand, and color and not color appeared over it before soaking into him. I'm sorry, he told her, and was surprised to find he meant it. She had been kind to him. It's all right, she answered, her cool voice soothing the worry away. Maybe it is time, and maybe you can do better than your predecessor. But that will only matter if you can get the others to be part of this. Others? Of course. Did you think I was the only one of us who is part of it? I did warn you this would be complicated. You will need to gain fire, earth, and air's approval to start with. Show to them you are the right one to start on this path to carrying this element, this burden. Burden? How do I do that? He asked, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Request an audience of them. Be honest with who you are, and it is possible they will agree. And if they don't, Tibbs wasn't sure he'd done the right thing anymore. Her touch wasn't enough to soothe the worry and fear away this time. This path will give you very little, unless you get it all. Your life would have been easier had you chosen me, Tibbs of humans. May this thing you call luck be with you on your journey. Tibbs barely had the time to put his hand under him to catch himself as he coughed out water. He tried to force it all out until he felt hands and heard Alistair. It's okay. Don't fight it. You're back. The water will leave by itself. Finally, Tibbs gasped air. When was the last time he'd breathed? How do you feel? Alistair helped him back into a kneeling position. Like I almost drowned? Speaking hurt. It'll pass. Tibbs crouched before him and smiled. You survived the audience. The man took Tibbs's head in his hand and stared into his eyes, surprise and fear in his. What's wrong? Tibbs asked, his voice cracking in fear. Your eyes. They're still brown. And this concludes chapter 13 of Bottom Rung. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter is going to be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read the story, it is available on Royal Road for free. If you want to read ahead, it is on my Patreon, where if you support me, you can read up to 9 chapters ahead at this time. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. on Twitch. The links are in the notes, and with that, I shall wish you a good day.